So companies in the top quartile for employee experience generate 50% more revenue than those in the bottom quartile. Maybe that's a good data point in terms of why it's important, why investing in AI, why providing the right kind of employee experience and tool set is, a strategic objective really for what organizations should be looking at.
Just before we get into today's episode, what I'd like to do is first of all introduce myself. My name's Peter Wilson. I've been part of the Advania team here for nearly 30 years. So you may find some gags around my age and some of the technologies that I've worked across during that period of time. But I think that gives me a great view of the way IT has changed over the years. And that gives me the ability to talk about IT and the circular nature that I believe that IT is moving on. So I think that can add a lot to the context of all of the great newer technologies that we're going to talk about. I'm joined today by Dan Coleby and Chris O'Brien. Chris, do you want to introduce yourself?
So I'm Chris O'Brien. I'm the Products and Services Director here at Advania. Been in the group 10 years or more, one way or another. I run a function that helps us innovate, helps us drive new services, helps us work out how we're going to be valuable to our clients next year and beyond.
And I'm Dan Coleby. I'm our Director of Client Technology Value. I've also been in the group for about 10 years. And I guess I've always been quite passionate about the strategy that customers follow and that we leverage our technology within, and looking for what the real business value is that we're going to get from that technology. So that's perhaps the angle that I'm going to bring to this podcast and a few others that I'm involved with. But as a whole across the series, what we're trying to do is expose the listeners and the viewers to the real breadth of capability we've got across Advania, but also really what we do for our customers to help them leverage that value of technology by using our different sets of expertise.
And I think it's fair to say, is it not, that we find ourselves having some really interesting conversations with clients about how they kind of navigate the current technology landscape, how they make use of AI, how they become a kind of more sustainable organization. And we thought that airing some of this publicly, as well as perhaps kind of sharing some of our journey, perhaps sharing some of the challenges that we faced and maybe pitfalls that we've encountered along the way, we thought that could maybe make some good content.
Absolutely. And so, welcome to the first episode of what will be an all-up Advania UK capabilities and challenges, as Chris says, session. I think hopefully everybody will find it really insightful, hopefully useful as well from a strategy point of view, but hopefully as well enjoyable. So for today's first episode, you've probably gathered, we're going to talk about AI being, the thing really within IT that everybody is talking about at the moment. But specifically, we're going to start talking about AI and the employee experience, because the two are really intrinsically tied together. And what I'd like to do, first of all, is probably hand over to Dan initially from your client experience perspective and say, from your perspective, what are you seeing in terms of, the way AI is affecting people's employee experience?
Well, I think employee experience is something that's been a common topic of discussion for, forever, but in particular the last 3 or 4 years, as we all have been so disrupted by COVID and lockdown and then moved into hybrid work. We're now seeing several customers and several companies more broadly, people like Amazon in particular, looking to get a 5-day return to office, which is very much changing that dynamic of a technology-enabled hybrid work environment. And it's bringing back to the fore some of those questions, some of those challenges that perhaps we thought we'd worked through in the last few years, when we found we'd got to a good place. Things are changing a lot. So the last few years have been a very disruptive time for people. I think some of that's been really good, some of that's been obviously very bad. And for me, technology has been the thing that has kept us going, has really changed that experience, really improved that experience in lots of ways, but maybe still falls short in some areas. I think in particular, well, this kind of, we're all sitting in 3 separate locations at the moment, recording what would otherwise be something like a fireside chat around a table, a coffee table with a few chairs. Technology has really enabled that remote communication and collaboration experience. And there's been a number of technologies, particularly things like Microsoft Viva comes to mind for me, where we've been trying to leverage data, we've been trying to leverage AI to both understand and improve that employee experience, but they've all perhaps fallen a bit short at some point. And now AI is a discipline which has been around for a very long time, but the generative AI capabilities that we have seen come to the fore in the last 2 years have really started to change what we can do as individuals and change what we can do collectively to give us time back to make our lives easier, maybe happier, to allow us to achieve a lot more, be more creative, have higher quality output, etc. And it's really, really changing that dynamic, I think, of how we live symbiotically with technology to help us through the human experience and the business value and productivity experience of being at work as an employee.
And there's probably a couple of interesting things in that, is there not? Because almost what the employee experience means is one thing to consider. You've got the physical experience when you go into the office, you've got the virtual experience. Either way, I think every organization is trying to create this strong fabric of employee engagement. And it is quite interesting, isn't it? This kind of movement that's happening at the moment about maybe trying to encourage or force employees to come to the office a little bit more than before. And I suppose you could say that AI, whether you're exclusively home working, whether you're hybrid, whether you're 5 days a week in the office, AI can potentially help in all of those, but some interesting kind of nuance about exactly how and where the value goes to in between employer and employee.
Yes, and I was going to pick up on one of Dan's points actually around that employee experience, and sort of go down the route of we've been trying to monitor and we've been able to try and manage people's employee experience over that time since COVID hit, using some technology tools and such like. And would you say that that's been successful? Obviously, people working remotely, we need to understand how they're feeling, how they're interacting, and really, monitor that employee experience, because it's really, really important to make sure that our users are well looked after. Do you think we're sort of working in that direction?
Well, certainly from my perspective, there's been lots of different technologies to try to help with that. Certainly initially the remote working, but then the experience that we all have as we change our working patterns. Personally, I worked quite closely with Microsoft as they launched the Microsoft Viva suite, and they had 2 components within that, which was Viva Insights, which was designed to monitor and measure the way that we were communicating and collaborating, both as individuals and as teams. And then there was Viva Topics, which was an AI-supported knowledge management tool that was designed to almost curate knowledge in the background and then surface it to us within our flow of work. Now, some companies have made a great success of leveraging those technologies, but I think it'd be fair to say that both of those technologies have not really had the success that Microsoft originally envisaged for them, or that we thought was a potential possibility for our customers. And I think the reason why is not that they were headed in the wrong direction or they were trying to achieve the wrong thing, but there were certain constraints around either what was being measured through things like Viva Insights. It was, it promised a great deal, but only really measured a small number of activities. And so I think the hype of that type of measurement tool was somewhat let down. I talk in terms of AI about people potentially falling into the trough of disillusionment that Gartner referred to on their hype cycles. And I think Viva Insights did that quite spectacularly, actually. I think that there was a lot of promise around what was possible, but because of the limited measurement, it didn't quite stick with most organizations. And I think the things like Viva Topics, knowledge management, and helping us navigate our way through this information labyrinth that we have has been an eternal challenge for most businesses, certainly since we moved away from the written quill and parchment, which limited the volume of data we could create. You probably remember that, Pete, actually.
Thanks, Dan,
I think
tablets of a different kind.
Exactly. Viva Topics was a great way of curating some of that data, but perhaps the user interface wasn't quite there. And I think now where we've moved on to with Microsoft and other technology vendors using those kind of things as a back-end enabler for what's more of a generative AI interface is actually driving the experience much more forward and much more positively for users, because instead of having to go off and read a topic, I can simply ask a question of Copilot, for example, and get my answer. But it's the same. These are all building blocks, and you go back to the stone tablets that you grew up with in school, Pete. But everything builds on top of each other, and we couldn't have this AI revolution if it wasn't for the underlying compute capability and the connectivity with the internet, etc. And each revolution we've seen over our lives and careers builds on top of the other. And I think the early attempts at driving a more an improved user experience and employee experience with technology, they were great, but it needed something to come and build on top of it. And I think some of the generative AI assistants that we're seeing, like Copilot, are definitely doing that now.
Yeah, there's another aspect that I wonder about, which is those earlier things like Viva Topics, Viva Insights, these kind of employee experience innovations from Microsoft in the past. They were quite forward thinking. So they share that with Gen AI and Copilot and other forms of AI. But do you think they were a bit more difficult to chart the path to kind of increased revenue or decreased costs or something like that? Do you think that is anything different with Gen AI and Copilot, do you think, or organizations wrestling with the same question?
I think it's still difficult.
Yeah.
You go on, you share your view, but it's still not easy.
I think, just picking up on a few points there, I think you're right, Chris, in terms of trying to find the value of those tools was difficult. But I think also trying to find the value of those tools, as a line manager as I am, trying to use some of the tools to understand how my team was impacted by working remotely, it was quite difficult. It was quite challenging, but also it took time. And, time was not something that we had on our side at that point in time. We were busy trying to get everybody working, trying to get everything done. So having another set of tooling that was adding to our workload really didn't help with that employee experience, understanding what they were doing. Now, flip that and look at AI. What's AI allowing us to do? Well, AI is actually giving us time back potentially. So, can you see the value of AI versus some of those employee experience tools? For me, yes. Could it be, therefore, that AI will help to reinvigorate potentially some of those employee experience tools? Maybe, because it's giving us the spare time we need to actually focus on the other pieces within that employee experience in arena from a manager point of view. So I can see the value in both, but to answer your question specifically, actually, from a CFO perspective, can you see the value of the employee experience tools that we were talking about? Less so. AI, I would say more so, but again, it depends what you're trying to measure and how you're trying to do that measure.
Yeah, and it's probably fair to say, is it not, that today most kind of people working on a value case or a business case for Gen AI, it's focused on productivity gains and time savings mainly. But what are the collective thoughts here? Does it extend beyond that? And if so, where?
I think it does, actually. So you're right, Chris, that the headline figure is I can save this amount of time by not doing mundane work. But also, not doing mundane work makes me feel better as an employee. Having the time to be able to focus on the things that I know really matter and make sure that I've thought through them well enough also has a positive effect for me. And I've seen this myself, but I've also seen it with customers. As a large financial services organization I've been working with, where that was one of the strongest pieces of feedback we got from their users, that because they suddenly had 15, 30, 45 minutes worth more time each day, they were using that to really make sure that they'd address the things that mattered most strategically to them or to the organization. And they were therefore feeling much less stressed, because previously they'd been worried that because they had so little time for everything that was on their plate that they weren't really giving the most important things the consideration they deserved. Whereas that time repay is, it was very positive for them in a kind of mental well-being and employee satisfaction perspective, as well as potentially saving the business costs or driving more revenue because of what they were doing with that time they got back.
Yeah. So taking out the drudgery, kind of giving people an enhanced tool set. And there's an interesting kind of dynamic to this, isn't there? About I think at Advania we've seen that we want to be providing an enhanced employee proposition, as it were. We see this as quite important in terms of retaining talent. You're trying to simplify people's jobs and tasks and make things a little bit easier rather than adding friction. But also potentially as a talent acquisition thing. You've got a new generation coming into the workforce. Everybody's using AI in different ways in their personal lives. And as we're being compared to another employer, we want to kind of come out favorably as somebody that's investing in making people's working lives a bit easier. And that kind of brings us back a little bit, does it not, with this trend of some businesses to kind of try and drive employees back to the office full time. And maybe there's an underlying question of this kind of value created by AI. Where does it land? Does it land with the employer and they're going to sort of soak up all of that gain somehow? Or does it come to the employee and that time saved is somehow with them? Or is there some kind of gain share here? Any reflections from either of you on that?
I think we're probably too early in the life cycle to really fully define where that borderline is. I would suggest that it's at neither end of that spectrum. So I think if it's the employer trying to take all the gain or the employee that's trying to take all of the gain, then we're probably getting things wrong. It needs to be somewhere in the middle, I would say, from so that both parties are taking a little piece from the gains that the technology is providing us with. We need to be looking after the staff. We need to be making sure staff are happy to work within the environment, because employee retention is a big thing. It's something that all businesses surely want to incorporate into their models.
Yeah, interestingly, I did have a conversation with somebody last week where they were talking about it in their organization, where it was at one end of the spectrum, as in employer wanted to see all of the gain. So what they were doing, which sounded quite extreme to me, is they were recalibrating people's objectives in a post-Copilot world. So you've got AI now, we've made an investment in licensing, we've given you the tools. If we think this is going to save you 20% of the time, we're going to reorg your targets and your objectives so that we're getting 20% more from you.
That's tough.
I think that is a tough and quite a hard approach. I think I'm seeing a bit of both at the moment. So in that currently the value is being divided between the employee and the employer for most companies that I'm seeing, and certainly for us internally at Advania. I am, however, seeing an intent from the customer to perhaps shift that dial more towards the employer in the future, and that comes from a desire to make the savings that you get tangible. So obviously, if you're saving somebody time and you're saving lots of people time collectively, you could make that tangible by employing less people now. You make some people redundant. And that's definitely been a fear amongst many of the change that generative AI would bring. But most organizations are not wanting to do that. They're wanting to support future growth without increased headcount cost. So, whilst today their employees might be getting some of that back in the way I described, feeling less stressed, etc., because they've got more time. If the plan is, well, over the next, maybe not in one go, suddenly you've got 20% more targets, but over the next 2 to 3 years, you'll get back up to the level of work that you were at pre-AI, because what we've done is depressed our hiring in order to save money. Then every bit of that is the employer taking it back, but taking it back in a tangible way. I think what sensible employers should do is recognize that a benefit for the employee is also a less tangible benefit for the employer, because if you've got happier employees, people are less stressed, they've been able to think more and make more strategic decisions. That is more difficult to quantify as a tangible benefit, but it is still very much a benefit to the employer as well as that employee. And striking that right balance, both now and in the future, I think is really important thing to do.
Yeah, and you might say that the CFO and the CHRO might have different perspectives on this, but not every gain can be modelled on a balance sheet or a P&L, but they are there.
Yeah, precisely.
That brings me actually onto another point that I think it's worth discussing, which is enabling the users to make best use of the technology. Now, I'm going to show my age again here, and I take everybody back, if you're old enough, to remember the days of WordPerfect. WordPerfect was a great application we used to use for word processing, where we'd use keyboard shortcuts, and everybody was fantastically productive with it as a piece of technology. But over time, that was replaced by Microsoft Word, as we know today. But that was more of a GUI interface with mouse and such like. And at that time, to be able to move people from one type of system to the other, we had to undertake lots of user training. It was very much a user intensive training session to make them see the advantages of using this mousy thing that actually allowed them to move around the screen rather than having to remember all of those keyboard shortcuts that they would have used previously within the less GUI based system. But for me, the movement to AI is very similar, that I believe we've got to engage significantly in user training to make sure that they've got all of the tools and the knowledge available to them. If you think back in the day, if we'd have just gone from WordPerfect to Word and said, get on with it, how productive would those people have been? They'd have been lost. Well, is this not the same type of situation? I don't know. Dan, you're nodding there. I think you agree. What?
Yeah, I 100% agree, Pete. And I referenced the trough of disillusionment for Gartner's hype cycle earlier. Every individual or any organization that I've seen fall into that trough have done so almost always because they've not done that user change and adoption work to the best extent. And in some ways, some of these tools, whether it's Copilot or whether it's an embedded AI in a line of business application like ServiceNow, or whether it's ChatGPT, in some ways they're intuitive tools that we should just know how to use. But they are very good at some things and they're not so good at other things, and they need to be engaged within a particular way. Yes, it's natural language that you use, but in the same way that if I said to you, Pete, I'd like a cup of tea, you could interpret that in so many different ways if you go and make me a cup of tea. But if I said to you, I'd like a cup of tea, I'm really thirsty because I've not had a drink all day, I'd love it to be piping hot with a splash of milk, and I'd like really fresh water from the tap and tea bags from the cupboard. I mean, first of all, you tell me I'm a very demanding colleague and probably go to HR saying I'm being unfair asking you to make tea. But at least you would know exactly what I'm asking for, what the context of it is, where I want you to source the information from, and what my expectation of the output is. And that's the way you need to talk to AI, whether it's in verbal or written conversation. And I think people don't instinctively get that for some reason. Whilst they would naturally talk to a colleague like that because they know the colleague needs that sort of level of information. For some reason, when they go to AI, they just go, "Make me a cup of tea," and they expect the outcome to be all of these unsaid things that they were thinking, and in reality, it's not. Of course, it's not. Obviously, Copilot can't really make tea, but it's a good analogy that I like to use. And yeah, but it just as you were saying, that transition from WordPerfect to Microsoft Word, because you're suddenly using the WIMP system, etc. Then that it was just the same then as it is now. And for people to skip that training, user adoption, change management, focus on use cases is the real fault that I've seen in most organizations that aren't getting value from AI.
Yeah, there's absolutely a muscle to build, isn't there? And one way I've been talking about it sometimes with CIOs is you need to hold back 20% of the budget for this, for business change and adoption. The idea of spending 100% of the budget on Gen AI and licenses and tech, that's where you are likely to run into challenges. And maybe that's, we can talk about our own journey with Gen AI here. We're certainly conscious that many Copilot or other Gen AI rollouts seem to fail or hit a sticky point or kind of get some initial adoption and then a drop off. Whereas we're feeling quite good about our usage and deployment, I would say. And I suppose that's some of the things that we have done. We feel like we have done a good job on all of the promptathon sessions, the lunch and learns, all of the local kind of sessions with different teams around the business, the champions network building. And that's what it takes, isn't it? This is a new skill and a new muscle to build.
100% it is. And, as we're probably some of the worst people to actually get hold of this tool, because we'll all do things in ever so slightly different ways. If I look at my usage of AI, has it been perfect? No. I've tried to build things like PowerPoint presentations, albeit there've been some releases since I last tried, but it's not worked at all. Some of the content that's been delivered really just has not been, worth me using AI to do that. But yet I've used other tools. So we have a private chat GPT. I'll use that to help import documents into, because it's easy and it's simple and it works. And then I'll bring that into a Copilot scenario to put in a better word, fettle that content, so that obviously that's then tuned, ready to go into a document. So I use it in that particular way because it works wonderfully well for me and has saved me hours and hours of work. But is it there for all of these pieces yet? No, I don't believe it is. And, it's an ever-evolving world. And that, I say, we're bad for this because we're technical people. We're not necessarily just standard end users. But, Dan, from your experience of other organizations that are using it, what challenges are you seeing out there?
Yeah, I mean, exactly the ones that you refer to, Pete, that it can be good and bad in different scenarios. I think also one thing we've done well within Advania, and we're seeing in some of our more successful customers, is it's not one tool fits all. We're using different AI tools depending on the job role of the person, depending on the scenario, depending on the data, etc. So yeah, for me, I spend a lot of my time in Microsoft Office applications, writing content, consuming content, creating presentations. So Copilot's probably my go-to point, but things like the AI tools within ServiceNow are really important to the service desk colleagues of ours, of which we employ several hundred people in that kind of role. I know, and I've seen some of our customers make really good use of solutions like our private chat GPT tool that you mentioned, where we can be far more specific and far more precise about the way that it's responding to certain types of questions. Maybe not as generic and as all-encompassing as Copilot, but much better at doing one specific task. Or using other technologies like SharePoint syntax. I know you've got some good experience with this, Chris, but very, very specific tools that are doing that one job really, really well. What we're not trying to do is take the sledgehammer of Copilot to crack the nut of compliance around supplier readiness or something along those lines.
Yeah, and I still find myself having this conversation quite a lot with CIOs. You're crafting your AI strategy, you're making buying decisions on what tools to put in front of the business, and I think it's rarely just one tool in isolation. I think most organizations that we're seeing, there is some blend of Gen AI and different tools. And if you think about it, that makes sense, because I think every app, every surface area, every SaaS tool that you're working with is going to have Gen AI embedded in it. But maybe some of the main threads, I feel like over the last 12 months, a lot of our Gen AI work has probably landed in 3 buckets. It feels like it's maybe Microsoft 365 Copilot enablement and everything that goes around that, whether it's readiness or kind of the adoption support. Private chat GPT as something that could be an alternative, but could also be a complement. I think we see it as a 50-50 case. And that's kind of, almost a organizational Gen AI platform that, maybe not be woven into the Office apps in the same way that Copilot does, but, can support some core needs as well as particular use cases. And then almost a third bucket of kind of some other form of Gen AI, whether it's a custom platform of some sort. Typically, it'll be based on Azure OpenAI for us, or something else in the Microsoft stack. and maybe it's solving a particular use case like RFP automation or due diligence questionnaires or something like this, or it's we've done some interesting work around construction and incident management, haven't we? And I kind of feel like those are the three broad buckets, and there's no right and wrong answer here for an organization. As they're sort of crafting their AI strategy, it's probably going to be a mix of different platforms, and you have to work out whether you're solving for general productivity gains, or you're kind of focused on particular use cases, and some of this guides the decision.
100% it does, and some of the successes we've had out there have been, I think, pretty spectacular in terms of the usage we've got out of AI generally. And I like to have that conversation about AI rather than Copilot, if that makes sense, because Copilot's taking us down a potential rabbit hole where other solutions could actually play as well as Copilot in those particular arenas. Now, we've talked there about what we're doing, but let's think about the future. I referenced earlier that, building PowerPoints and things has been a challenge for me over time. And, Microsoft made some announcements last week around their Copilot agents that will be able to, take control of actions without human input. Chris, do you want to pick up the baton at that point?
Yeah, sure. So it's interesting, isn't it? So we're moving into this era of agentic AI, and I'm already a little bit tired of hearing that word. But, it is a kind of a next step onwards, I think, because Copilot and other tools have been very human-led. So we've all got used to the idea of going to a chat interface, and that's how we go for answers. That's how we find information. That's how we try to kind of accelerate us in this particular task. But the promise of agentic AI is that it's going to be more autonomous, to do more things itself, maybe to elevate beyond just kind of helping with a task to helping more with a job. And, perhaps a new era of value to be unlocked. But, I think that's a big part of it, but also quite interesting, just the broader impact on employee experience. So I was reflecting the other day, Gartner feel like there'll be a sort of 25% or 27% drop in search engine usage over the next couple of years, which is quite interesting. And maybe the other kind of aspect of looking forward is how Gen AI helps people maybe with a disability, and it becomes a bit of a leveler like that. People that can't really understand what's in an image, but when you've got Gen AI able to describe it in real detail, or a video even, lots of unlocks there. Dan, so we were talking about agentic AI earlier. What were your thoughts?
We were. Although I'd really reinforce that point about enabling people to perhaps overcome barriers that they would otherwise have had. I mean, it's not a significant disability. I have a colleague who has quite bad dyslexia, and he's found that Gen AI tools like Copilot really, really helpful to help him phrase things in the right way, help him spell things in the right way, to just be that sounding board to check his work before he sends it out, really. And it's really boosted his confidence and his productivity as well. I think when you look though at more agentic AI, I mean, it almost comes back to, so when, obviously AI has been around for a long period of time, and I think the previous iteration of AI was all about process automation, and we called it robotic process automation. It was agentic by its very definition. And then generative AI was very much not that. It's been supportive of the human, as you said, Chris. It's been an assistant to us. It works on a task by task basis. I often talk about it being like a dog with a stick. You throw the stick, it expertly brings it back, and it sits there patiently waiting for you to throw it again. And that capabilities really helped us be more efficient, and achieve all of the benefits we've been talking about on this podcast. In the context of what it could do, that's still quite slow. As you say, it's helping on a task by task basis, whereas maybe my hypothetical dog, could go and collect a load of sticks and build me a house from them. That would be an output that might be ultimately what I'm trying to do with the sticks. And if I get that output without having to intervene every step of the way, that could be really, really positive for me as an individual. Equally, if my employer turn around and go, well, we don't need you anymore because this agentic AI over here can do the whole of the job you were doing. We don't need you to guide it anymore. We don't need you to provide that human input. Then arguably that's a bad outcome, certainly in the short term for me, until I manage to find a different job or reskill or pivot to doing something different.
Dan, I'm just going to come in there because Gates has an interesting perspective on this. So if you imagine Bill Gates, he's been around tech for for a while now, and his comment was, I'm a really good philanthropist. I know how to kind of mobilize around a particular effort, whether it's malaria or something else. I know how to raise funds. I know how to kind of create a big movement around something. I know how to almost kind of bring everything together to help solve a problem on global scale. At some point, AI is going to be better than me at all of those things. So, where do I go? Where do I go at that point? Which is interesting and probably not invalid. But at the same time, do we think that's close, or do we think that we're some way off those concerns? And is there, I suppose, to build on that, is there anything more near term that could be what to focus on?
I'm going to pick on Dan as well at that point. And, my view of AI is very factual. I don't believe it's got necessarily the viewpoint and can take all of the inputs that a human can do. So I think, trying to replace a human with AI, I think we're a long way away from that. I think, you will always have to have a human almost checking that output to make sure it is, Dan's house of sticks. Let's say the dog picked up the wrong type of stick because we weren't specific enough, or the house has been built with 2 bedrooms instead of 4 because we didn't ask for the right size of house. All of these things, the human input will add to that capability that I don't think AI's got, almost that capability of second guessing all of the things that we can do as individuals. Let's take being a doctor, for instance. You go to a doctor's surgery. Now, AI absolutely, if you give it a list of symptoms, is very likely to be able to give you a very detailed idea of what's wrong with that individual. But what about the other senses that doctor's got, that's looking at the person to try and understand all of those things that aren't actually written down, aren't actually said by that patient, but they can see that the patient's sweating, the patient's nervous, whatever it might be, that's additional symptoms that they need to consider in terms of that diagnosis, that AI just wouldn't, at this stage, I don't think has got that capability at all, and for me could be a very long way away.
If you're passing that baton to me to respond, I think this could be a whole podcast in itself. I mean, maybe it will be in a few months' time. My view is you paint a very accurate picture of the current state, Pete, and I agree with the limitations that you're talking about. For example, my mother had an operation a week ago, and with the right kind of robot, potentially AI could have done the physical operation far better than the surgeon. But the bedside manner of both the surgeon and the anaesthetist just absolutely blew me away, and calmed my mum down in such a way that, I couldn't see a robot doing that at the moment, or any kind of AI interface. However, I think the things you describe are a limitation of the inputs to the AI. At the moment, we're training it largely based on text, and we're interfacing with it largely based on text. And if we'd been recording this a few months ago, it would have been only based on text. But now GPT-4o and other models allow different modes of input and output. Personally, I think that some of these characteristics that we hold dear as being human are more about our amazing ability as humans to sense the world around us, take in millions of data points in any one point in time, and process those in a way that we see as being perhaps instinctive or empathetic or emotional. But ultimately, though, it's a learned way of computing some of that data. And my view, and I'm not trying to be fatalistic about it, I see it as a positive move, but my view is that as the input capabilities of AI improves, and as its training therefore improves, we'll see far more human-like behavior coming out of it than we might be able to envisage today. And I'm not saying yes, of course they'll take over the world, and I'm certainly not predicting a sort of Terminator-like future for the human race. But yeah, I think when I listen to what you're saying, you're describing limitations of input and limitations of training, and maybe limitations of thought capability, all of which I think will improve actually quite quickly. So yeah,
So taking us towards some kind of emotional intelligence almost in AI.
yes, I think so. But
Yeah.
the ultimate definition of what's human and what's not will be increasingly interesting.
Right, because AI can't really have an experience in the same way that a human can. So some of those things that we connect on could be interesting. Just following on from that, because you're right, we could go down an entire track of that. But I suppose we've mentioned the human in the loop element there, and it feels like near term there's a few things to think about there, because AI not used too heavily for decision making in some of our work today, but is in other industries, or certainly increasing questions coming up about, can we rely on AI? Can we ethically rely on AI to make decisions or do more of the work with what we've got today? Any thoughts on that? I mean, do we see ourselves moving away from kind of human in the loop for some of these things, or do we think that's just how kind of AI operating models need to be for a while?
I guess one key area you're sort of alluding to there, Chris, is HR. And let's take recruitment for an example, where obviously you can have a job definition, and you could relatively easily ask AI to compare somebody's CV against that job definition to do some initial screening for you to understand whether that person is applicable for that role or not. Would that be a good use of AI today? I don't know. If I'm recruiting, I actually like to look at all the CVs, because there might be an off the wall one that you look at that might go, something might jump out at you that isn't related, but actually is related in a sort of different sort of way that AI might not pick up, in my view. I don't know, Dan, what do you think?
I guess we've got a couple of thoughts on that. So specifically on the recruitment one, apologies to any recruitment consultants who are listening, but I've had a torrid time with recruiters in the past, and I've tended, on a personal basis at least, to avoid using recruiters when either looking for a role myself or trying to hire people, because I've often found you get a set of CVs from a recruiter, and I kind of want to turn the order upside down. The people at the top of their pile are actually the worst candidates in my experience. And it's the people they've just cut off the bottom that I really want to speak to. And the reason is because the recruiter, without understanding the nuances of the role, has picked up buzzwords off that person's CV, or has listened to the sales patter that they've got when they've spoken to them. And sometimes that marries with capability and you get the perfect candidate. More often than not, though, those kind of characteristics that people exhibit are cloaking the fact that they don't actually have the underlying capability to do the job. And so I think right now we're probably in that nuanced perspective of the AI might appear to be doing an amazing job at that kind of task where they're making judgments about humans, but it's more subtle. Again, without going back on what I just said, I think that will change over time. I do think, though, that there's a moral guideline around how we leverage AI, and in fact, regulations like the GDPR will say to us that we shouldn't be using AI to make decisions that impact humans without that human out in the loop, without that human oversight. And so, whilst HR scenarios, whether it's recruitment or whether it's disciplinary or whether it's annual reviews, those kind of things, whilst AI might be very helpful on a task by task basis at making those processes more efficient and effective, maybe even more balanced, that we're all instinctively subjective as humans, whereas the AI is not. The AI is much more objective in the way that it looks at things, and unless you specifically tell it not to be. So there are ways in which AI can very much help, but I think certainly for the moment, until AI may or does not prove to be better than humans in this stuff, I think having that human oversight and a human in the loop there is really, really important. And it's not only the thing that we should morally do, is also something which we're required to do by certain regulations like GDPR.
And I think, even if you take out the decision making, almost like the harder edge of some of these AI usages, there's almost like an ethical, or you mentioned moral there, Dan, kind of aspect to some usages. Like I have, well, in HR, I have used it in kind of the annual performance review cycle, but only in a certain way. So conceivably, you could use AI. Look, here are 5 bullet points on employee A, write up their annual review based on them. I don't think that would be high integrity as a leader if you're kind of using AI in that way. But what I have done is kind of think about that person, think about what they've achieved, think about their objectives and so on. Do all the work of writing kind of the review, and then asking AI to critique it. What does this miss, or what does this not do? And, you find some great help from AI, I think, in those circumstances. It said, look, balanced feedback, some really good points, and you're providing the evidence. In this area, you're not very specific. In this area, you really need an example to back up the point that you're making. And you look at it and think, yeah, that's right. And I completely missed those things. So sometimes it's just about how you're choosing to use AI, isn't it? And I think we're coming in some interesting questions like that.
It is. And, from an email perspective, just taking that up, Chris, I have used AI with email to check the tone of emails I'm sending to individuals to make sure I'm not shouting at somebody. So I have used it to mellow the tone of emails over time. And actually, it's been really good at that, because it's like, you might want to soften this bit, or you might want to soften that bit. So, it saved me an awful lot of pain from that perspective.
It seems like it's giving you the same feedback, Pete. So whenever I kind of start a mail like, this is bonkers, why are we doing this? It kind of reminds me that's not necessarily the best framing.
Absolutely. So yeah, from an employee experience point of view, it's absolutely helping us in a lot of what we do today, and I think saving us massive amounts of time. And just thinking now and wrapping up the session, have you got any final thoughts? I'll come to you first, Dan, on the employee experience and AI as we are today, and whether you feel it is making the difference everybody's sort of expecting it to, or are we in that trough?
Yeah, sorry, I just have to think about your question for a second. I think it is actually, and if I think back over my career, perhaps my life, I think it's one of the biggest impacts that it's starting to have an impact that I think will be one of the biggest impacts I've ever experienced. And as a technologist a few years ago, I was almost getting a bit bored and thinking, what do we do now? We've moved to the cloud, we've done this, we've modernized this, we've got all this evergreen stuff, we've learned from the problems of the past and we've fixed a lot of them. Where do we go now? And the last couple of years has been this explosion of opportunity, which we're only just starting to leverage, either as individuals or as organizations. I think I'll come back to my point before. Things like the internet have absolutely revolutionized the way that we live and work and communicate and learn, etc., etc. But everything's incremental, building on top of the next. So why would a generative AI not be even more impactful? Because it's standing on the shoulders of those giants that we've all lived and experienced in the past. So yeah, I'm having to challenge myself and change the way I work and change the way I think a little to leverage it. But I think is being and will be absolutely transformational in the way that I work and the way that we can all engage with each other and work together as a community of people.
Absolutely.
Yeah, a couple of sort of final points on that. I think you're right, Dan. I find myself in the same place. A couple of things that we might see in the future, maybe increased use of voice. Now we've got these models that, can really be almost like real-time conversationalists, and you can get kind of instant help from AI without typing. And I also think we can anticipate some other things, like today, Gen AI is helping me, maybe tell my story a little bit in PowerPoint, or generate content, or summarize, or help me find information. All of those things are great. But sometimes, I'm lining up bullets in PowerPoint, and that's not really the kind of the higher order task in the middle of this. The higher order task is pitching for that investment, or persuading a client to kind of come with us, or kind of demonstrating to the business that, you know, we need to make this change. That's what I'm really trying to do. And the fact that I'm sort of spending time kind of on indentation in Word or alignment of things on a PowerPoint slide, you know, it's great that AI can help me with those today, but I think we'll see an increasing kind of coming up the stack, as it were, won't we, in terms of how AI is adding value?
Absolutely. And, you know, again, I'll show my age. So when I started with Advania, we didn't have an internet link. So I've seen that change happen over my time here with the business. And I do think AI is one of those inflection points, very much like the internet was, that is changing the way that we do business, the way that we work. So from an employee experience point of view, for me, it's massive. And I think it will change forever the way that we do things. It will, you know, very much like when word processors came out, it changed the way people worked in terms of, you know, typing pools and all of that sort of thing. It will be the same type of change, but as long as we embrace the change and we all look at the opportunities that that will bring, for me, it's going to be a great thing for employee experience. It will change the way we work. It will get rid of some of the mundane stuff, but it will make things more exciting and more fun and more productive, which I think is the key thing for all of us.
Yeah. On that, maybe I'll help us wrap up with a stat that I came across earlier today that seemed relevant. Harvard Business Review stat talking about AI and employee experience. So companies in the top quartile for employee experience generate 50% more revenue than those in the bottom quartile. So, you know, maybe that's a good data point in terms of why it's important, why investing in AI, why providing the right kind of employee experience and tool set is, you know, a strategic objective really for what organizations should be looking at.
Fantastic. Great way to end. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Chris. Thank you for listening. And we look forward to meeting you again on the next Technology Boardroom podcast. Thank you very much.